Okay, the webinar has started. I believe we are officially live now. Hello everybody, and welcome from me, Milena Deleva. I have the pleasure to be the director of Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. And for those of you who are new to our work, we create a literary nexus between the Anglosphere and Bulgaria and cross exposures like this one today. CapitaLiterature is one of our international programs, annual programs that normally takes place in Sofia in person. Not this year, though. The focal theme of this year's edition is writers and influences, and invites contemporary writers to present their literary influences or literary friendships. And we are starting the second week of the series with Jeffrey Eugenides. It's a great honor to have you join our series today. Jeffrey Eugenides was born in Detroit, Michigan. He holds a degree in English and creative writing from Brown University and Stanford University. Eugenides' first book, The Virgin Suicide, was published in 1993 and was adapted for the screen by Sofia Coppola. 10 years later, he received Pulitzer Prize for his novel Middle Sex, which was also a finalist for the National Book Critical Circle Award and the Impact Award. He's the author of the anthology, My Mistress's Sparrow is Dead, Great Love Stories from Chekhov to Monroe, and his novel, The Marriage Plot, received the Salon Book Award. Eugenides is the recipient of many other prestigious awards, including fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Whiting Writers Award. His fiction has appeared in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, the Yale Review, Best American Short Stories, the Gettysburg Review, and Grante's Best of Young American Novelists. He teaches creative writing at Princeton University. Our moderator today is Manuel Pekov. He's the publisher at Jeanette 45 Publishing, where he oversees books in translation. The titles he published have received numerous awards, most notably the Krastan Diankov Translation Award and Hristo Gedanov Award for Best Translation. His authors include impressively diverse list of names, including Edgar Keret, Wendy Cuera, Perinush Sani, Juan Pablo Villalobos, Rana Dasgupta, Milenko Jorgovic, and Ayatollah Akbari, Carlo Petrini, Leonardo Padura, and last but not least, Jeffrey Eugenides. Manuel likes to translate poetry, and one of his most acclaimed translations is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge. Known as the singer among the Bulgarian publishers, unfortunately, he won't be able to perform for us today. Oh, no. He's running for MP and is amid his campaign, and at the center of which is reducing the VAT on books in Bulgaria. Very important job. Before I turn it over to our interlocutors, a quick rundown of the event. After the brief presentation and conversation, short reading maybe, we'll enjoy short reading from the celebrated novel Middle Sex, followed by Q&A from you, our guests today. You can use Q&A and you can actually post your questions as the conversation moves on. If you are watching this event on the Facebook, now the live stream, and if you need translation into Bulgarian, please join the webinar because only the original audio will be streamed. And the link will be posted briefly on Facebook. Ако гледате събитието през Facebook и имате нужда от превод, моля да се присъедините към вебинара в Zoom. The webinar is also your only chance to get a discount code for the novels by Jeffrey Eugenides that have been published in Bulgarian by Jeanette 45. We will post the code here in the Zoom chat. Special thanks to the U.S. Embassy in Bulgaria and Sofia Municipality, our interpreter, Elena Alexieva. The translation into Bulgarian of the excerpt, which maybe Jeffrey will read today, is by Milena Popova. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for taking the time to contribute to our series while busy writing your new book. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. It doesn't seem like we can be in person anywhere these days, but things are getting better. Anyway, I'm happy to be here with you. I know that the festival has as its theme this year influence, and I've been asked to just speak generally about my thoughts about literary influence. It's a thorny topic. I always think of Harold Bloom's book, The Anxiety of Influence. I think that was the first time I even heard about the idea of literary influence, and the fact that anxiety was in the title, I think, has influenced me ever since. I've always been treated the idea of literary influence with a certain amount of anxiety. And the tenor of my comments today will be to tell you a little bit how I got over some of my anxiety of influence. I think that a writer has to confront the anxiety, but hopefully not live in it for the rest of his or her life. Just to begin, I guess I would put myself in a historical line, or I'd like to place myself in a timeline, myself and other writers of my generation. We were growing up mainly in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, when we were forming our first ideas about literature, especially in the 70s when I was in high school and then entered college. And most of the writers who were popular at that time were postmodern writers who were, in a sense, deconstructing literary forms and literary conventions. So the first writers that I read seriously and was influenced by were writers who were taking apart the machine in many ways. I'm thinking of writers like Robert Coover, Ronald Sukenik, who is probably not very well known in Bulgaria or in fact in the United States. But these are writers who were trying to show up the conventions of storytelling, and to sort of look under the hood of the engine of fiction and see how it works, and play around with it and make a certain amount of fun of it. And that arose from a spirit of anti-authoritarianism. I think we're in a similar period now. And it arose as a kind of political response to official narratives. And the writers who took up the postmodern mantle tried very often to maybe discredit traditional forms of storytelling. So I'm just a young boy reading my first books and being greatly influenced by these writers, and that has had a lasting influence on me. But because I was young and I hadn't read that widely yet, in a sense, I was becoming more familiar with experimental fiction before I understood the traditional forms that the postmodernists were reacting against. It's a little bit as if I were a visual artist, and the first paintings I ever saw were Cubist paintings by Braque or Picasso, and I began painting Cubism, or trying to copy Cubism before I understood how to draw a figure or what figuration was about. Of course, this is a little simplistic. I read lots of Dickens as a kid. I read lots of traditional books in school. So I had influences mainly from England, I think, that affected me as a young boy. And I remember writing in a slightly Dickensian way, even as early as 13 or 14 years old. But when I became serious about writing and literature, the writers who were most influential on me were more experimental writers, Thomas Pynchon or even Beckett, and to a certain extent Vladimir Nabokov. So that's where I came into the process of writing, and that's where I began. And then after a number of years, I began to read more widely in 19th century literature, or at least more seriously, and encountered writers like Tolstoy and Henry James. I see in the advertisement for this talk, a big group of writers' faces there, and I don't know if I'll touch on all of them, but at least I've already mentioned Tolstoy and Henry James. I think those are two of the heads I saw in the email. It was a revelation to read both writers. Henry James I actually had read in high school a number of times. At that point, I would have thought I was forced to read it. I didn't really take to Henry James as a teenage boy, and then grew to appreciate and love his work and be influenced by it later on in life. But the big revelation for me was reading Tolstoy in my early 20s. Read it on my own, was never assigned Anna Karenina in college, and I was, just absolutely amazed at the narrative propulsion, psychological insight, the excitement of Tolstoy's ability to go into so many different points of view. It was one of the greatest reading experiences of my life, and coming after such deep immersion in experimental fiction, I was a little surprised to be enjoying it so much and to be finding so much wisdom about life from Tolstoy. A writer whom, when I was younger, I probably would have thought was going to be outdated. So that sort of set up the bind, or the exquisite condition that I've been in ever since, which is part of my being very alert to innovation and experimentalism, and another part wishing to hold true and hold fast to traditional modes of storytelling, the creation of characters, the idea that at the heart of any piece of writing is a story, is a narrative, and not to be dismissive of some of these elemental traditional forms. If you look at all of the writers who are on, who I've mentioned as influences, you can see that some of them are more experimental than others, and some would be considered to be realist writers operating in a naturalistic format. I think, furthermore, if you think about literary influence in general, it can come down in two or three avenues. There's stylistic influence. There is theoretical or philosophical influence, and then I think there is narrative influence. The stylistic is the one I think most people think of when they think about influence, like what a writer's style is like. Who does the writer sound like? Who does the writer write like? Does the writer write long sentences that remind them of Proust? Long, complicated interior sentences? Does a writer write short, clipped, slightly emotionless sentences like Hemingway? That sort of thing. Usually you think of writers' influence as being a kind of physical resemblance to the writer they're influenced by. And in my case, I began very attentive and remain attentive to style in writing. It's the first thing I think about when I encountered a piece of writing. How well written is it? What sort of technique does the writer have? How many mistakes is the writer making, in my opinion, per paragraph? What's shabby writing? What's sloppy writing? That's at the heart of anything that I admire, when all those things are being handled with the greatest expertness. That's usually the kind of writing that I like. So obviously, writers like Nabokov or Saul Bellow were always high on my list. And from Nabokov, whom I read constantly as a young person, I became very attentive to the visual detail and the precision of language. Nabokov had a famous quote saying that you needed the imagination of the scientist and the precision of the artist to be a writer. And I always liked that quote, because most people would think that it was the scientist who needed to be precise and the artist who needed to be imaginative. But Nabokov flipped that on its head and made very clear that the writer is the one who needs precision with visual detail, with sight, with describing something. And Bellow is the same way. Bellow always said that a novelist has to be a first-rate noticer. So both of those writers write with language that is original and fresh, that is an acute depiction of the visual world. The language, in a sense, renders the world anew for the writer, and they became my touchstones in terms of the style of my writing, the actual sentences that I compose. Philosophically, I've given you some idea of the different schools of thought that I've encountered and have wrestled with. I remain a postmodernist in certain ways, even despite myself. I'm always aware that what I'm writing is a written object. I'm aware of questions about the doubts that can be placed at the idea of an omniscient narrator. Some people, it's very popular these days to say that you can only write from a first-person I point of view, that the only point of view that is stable and is verifiable is one's own, and that you write from your own perspective, and you take your biases and your limitations with you. A writer like W.J. Sebald was very much a proponent of that. I think he believed that any writer who wrote in the third person was fraudulent, and that you couldn't do it anymore. And I understand that attitude, and I'm aware of it, and I'm constrained by it to a certain degree, but I don't agree with it at all. I don't believe in placing limitations on writers in terms of their imagination across the board, either the kinds of points of view they adopt, whether they want to write in first person, third person, the kind of characters they want to portray. I think it is the job of the novelist to go into as many other heads as he or she can. And once you deny the writer, the fiction writer, the ability to do that and the freedom to do that, what you're going to have is a literature that's constrained and impoverished. And one cannot imagine any of the greatest writers, or most of the greatest writers, writing that way. We wouldn't have Shakespeare, we wouldn't have Tolstoy, we wouldn't have Henry James, we wouldn't have Virginia Woolf if we made those rules. We would have Proust, we would have some great writers, but not everyone can be Proust. In fact, nobody else can be Proust. Theoretically, I've as I mentioned before, I've kind of straddled those two worlds. My books, on the face of them, some of them are more experimental than others, but they always hew to a kind of narrative center, and they do not diminish human character and make it merely a display of a kind of trope. They are not ironic to the point where it denies a sense of humanity to the characters. Some postmodern writers merely began to seem as though they were playing with their characters. The characters were just ways to get ideas across. I don't really feel that way about literary character. I think literary character should be like human character. It should be, have depths that you can't penetrate, and you try your best to penetrate it, but you may never get there. But to deny it, to treat it as more simplistic than it is, I think is an error. And then the third area of influence I mentioned was narrative, and I think that involves just the kind of stories that you tell. I think you do pick up ways of telling stories and the kinds of stories you tell from other writers. For instance, I'll just mention two of my books and how that happened. my first book, The Virgin Suicides, is told by a collective narrator of boys who kind of are arrested adolescents. Seems to be told by a group of teenage boys. It's actually a group of middle-aged men who still are teenage in their hearts. And when I wrote it, I didn't really know where I was getting that idea from. I thought it had never been used before, particularly. And it hadn't been used in quite a while when I wrote that book. It became more popular after that book, and you see it more often. But the first person plural voice in 1993 was very unique, and that's why the book got noticed. But it was years later that I realized where I'd gotten that idea, or where I'd come across it before. And it was in a short story by William Faulkner, who is not pictured in the email. And it's a story called A Rose for Emily, which is told by a town consciousness. It's a short story I probably read in middle school, maybe in 9th grade, that affected me a lot. And sometimes influences are like that. You take them in almost before you recognize it. They become part of you, part of your imagination, part of the way you think about the world. And then you'll write later on, drawing on that influence without even knowing it. It's like a genetic inheritance that you're unaware of. And so I began writing The Virgin Suicides in a town consciousness, a we voice, what the town knew. It helped me a lot because I was a young writer and I didn't really have a very firm sense of myself. I still don't have a firm sense of myself, but even more so at that age. So to get out of my limited ego and to write from the town, the people that I grew up with, allowed me to know a lot more than I actually did know, because I didn't know where I grew up. I knew the people who lived there. I knew how they thought. And if I could access their minds or speak through them, I suddenly had a story to tell, and I suddenly had knowledge about the world. I limited that focus. I narrowed the focus of that voice to a group of boys, because as I played around with the book, I saw that the greatest amount of heat was being generated whenever the boys were talking, and whenever the boys were focused on this group of girls who lived in a house across the street. So I took the Faulkner idea of a town consciousness and narrowed it to this group of boys, and that and wrote the book that way. Now the other thing about The Virgin Suicides is that it's a kind of detective story in a way. The boys are trying to piece together the mystery of why the 5 Lisbon sisters all committed suicide. And that book, that idea resembles the book by Garcia Marquez, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where the narrator goes to a town to try to figure out exactly what happened with the murder of a man in a South American village. So those two things were the inspiration and greatest influences on The Virgin Suicides. One, the Garcia Marquez, I was more proximate to. I kind of knew I was using a faux detective story as my means of narration. But the deeper one, the town consciousness, it was so long buried in my mind that I didn't know that I was employing it. And that brings up a major thing I wanted to say about the anxiety of influence, is that influence is not always a negative or constraining thing. It's not merely that you're stealing from another writer or you're copying another writer. It's not a mark of your own inability to write or your inability to be original, as it sometimes seems, and as it often feels to a writer. Influence can actually be a means of discovering your own talent, because I've found that the writers whose books move me and the writers whose books open my eyes to ways of writing are really allowing me, or have allowed me, to discover abilities in myself. Influence lets a writer discover his or her own talent, in a sense. It's not merely that you're you're a thief taking something. That capacity and that tendency is lying dormant in you. And when you read a writer who influences you, what's happening is that's being awakened in you by another writer. So Harold Bloom could have called his book Something Else Without Anxiety, being in the title. You know, the gift of influence instead of the anxiety of influence would be just as apt a title, I think, because that's how it's worked for me. Let's see. I've never had a singular voice as a writer. You're told that as a young writer when you're writing your first stories, or if you do take creative writing courses, they tell you to find your voice. That's what you're supposed to do. And I was always flummoxed by that idea, because I didn't have a singular voice. Some writers do. And again, you could mention Hemingway or Proust. They arrived at a voice. They didn't start off having it, but they arrived at a voice that became very distinctive, recognizable, and they employed that voice in all of their books. There are other writers whose voice shifts more from book to book. I could name Philip Roth as a example of a writer who has written in a strongly comic vein, as he did in Portnoy's Complaint and other books like Our Gang, and he's also written books with a slightly different, more discursive, realistic style, as in American Pastoral and The Human Stain. I mean, you can tell it's the same writer. It's coming from the same source. There's many things that are commensurate both in all of his work, or recognizable in all of his work. But he changes the kind of books that he writes. Someone like Ishiguro would be another example of writing a book in the voice of an English butler for one novel, and then writing other books where the voice is completely different. So you don't have to have a voice that is your own. In a way, I've learned to realize that maybe it's better not to have an identity, not to have a firm identity as a writer, because it allows you to shapeshift more often. And I became more comfortable with the fact that I didn't have a literary voice that was so distinctive. I read a fair amount of Catholic theology and books on Catholic mysticism. And I think a metaphor that's applicable here is when Catholic writers talk about the difference between the ego and the true self. The ego is not what will survive after death. The ego is not what is ever in conversation with the deity. It's a deeper self that is in conversation with the universe or with God, and it's a mistake to think that your ego is controlling things. I think it works the same way with writing. I think that influence, I think a writer's real self can come out not merely in the stylistic tics that he or she uses, but in a kind of feeling that flows from the work, almost underneath the work, like a deeper self should be accessed in writing. And that's what readers respond to. What they respond to is the flow of emotion and feeling and attitude from that deeper self. And that deeper self is almost, it's not immune to influence, but it is your deepest realist self. And so that's the more I write and the older I get and the more I try different ways of writing, what I realize is underneath the best writing is that kind of, limitless, deep self-feeling that flows from it. And that's what I think you can see in someone like Philip Roth. the books might be different on their surface, they might be different in their attitudes, they might be different in their strategies, but there's a kind of feeling that comes out of his work, a kind of energy that is consistent and that you can feel. And it's like a person's personality as opposed to the way they look. And I think that's the major component of writing, and you form that over years from all the influences in your life. And they're not only literary, they're sometimes they have a lot to do with what you've been through, what you've lived through, what you've suffered, and what you've learned about in life. That's, I think, most of my my thoughts about influence. So I think we could open up the interview portion of this.
Well, thanks a million, Jeffrey. It was really illuminating. I'd like to start actually with the following. I read somewhere on the internet about an advice you give to your writing students about how they should write. And it's one of the most wonderful things I've ever read about writing. You said something like, imagine writing the best letter you've ever written to the smartest friends you ever had. I think this is absolutely fascinating. And can you elaborate on that a little?
I certainly can. Yeah, I did say that. I said you should write as though you're writing the best letter you ever wrote to your smartest friend. And the reason I said that is that I think it's true. If you're writing to your best friend, and if you notice how you speak to your best friend, you use a shorthand with that friend that you know that the friend will understand. You don't over-explain yourself. You assume a familiarity with the friend. You are very much yourself. You don't put on airs. You don't take on pretensions. Your friends will spot when you're faking or when you're pretending to be someone you're not. So you have to be honest with your friends. Your friends know who you are. So that's the first thing that happens when you write that way. But it's also important that you're writing a letter to your smartest friend, not your dumbest friend, because the smart friend is going to get you, and the friend is going to be willing to follow you, even when you maybe tax the friend's ability to understand you. There's a kind of, well, there's a friendship, there's a love there, there's an intimacy, but there's also with a smart friend, you never dumb down your prose. You never think I've got to make it cheap, this part, because the friend will get bored. The friend needs these obvious devices to stay interested in the story. No, I mean, if it's your smartest friend, that friend is going to reject all of the cheap tricks that writers use. So it's another reason why it's a good thing to have in your head. And there's just the intimacy, the fact that you're speaking to someone, I think helps with writing. I mean, whenever you think you're writing to an audience or writing to a certain group, I think you more easily begin to pontificate and become a bore. But if you're writing to a friend, that gives the quality of intimacy that I think occasions the best writing.
It's there's a reason why I'm saying that. People frequently mention the fact that you are among very few contemporary writers whose work is equally appreciated by critics and by readers. And I notice I've published hundreds of titles in my lifetime. We just had a book fair last week. And when some young guy comes to our stand and says, "What do you recommend?" which is a very difficult question when you've published so many books and when you publish 100 titles a year, roughly. You know, I always say, well, not always, but it comes to my mind that I frequently do that. You know, I say, okay, I've published many great books and they are wonderful books. But if you ask me where my heart lies, it's with this, and this book. And your book is always there. Middlesex is always there. I published the other two as well, but Middlesex is where my heart lies. And I've always felt, you know, this is the first time we meet in person, but I've always felt as if I've been talking to a friend. So what you're saying to people is very much true, you know, in my own perceptions, I'd say.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me carry on because we don't have much time. You frequently, I've seen videos and conversations with you. You mentioned the fact that, well, at least going back 10 years or so, that Detroit is the only city you can write about, and at most, the furthest you can go would be Chicago. But speaking about people from the West Coast, for example, you know, you don't understand their psyche. Now that you live on the East Coast, has that changed somehow? Because when we talk about influences, there's also the influence of the locality, the place where you were born, and its peculiarities. From the point of view of somebody who lives in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, America is something solid. In fact, it's
you dropped out right at the end. You said something about it's not solid or it is solid, and then I didn't hear the rest.
Sorry, yeah. I'm saying that to us, America is something abstract, but it's something solid that we mostly know from movies about, and of course from the novels we read. But it takes a lot of experience and imagination to realize that there are many small universes in this country called America, and the Midwest, the East Coast, the West Coast, local communities, the South, absolutely fascinating and completely different.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I didn't mention about biographical influence, but it's probably more important than anything else. I grew up in Detroit most of my first 18 years, and obviously those are the years when we form our most vivid impressions. And I have continued to write about the city. I've written about other cities. I've set stories in New York. Part of The Marriage Plot happens in New Jersey and in Rhode Island. I've written about San Francisco, but I always do come back to Detroit because I know it best. Or I know, you know, I certainly know it best at the time I lived there. And I have a connection to it that's unrivaled. The only other place I feel very almost as enmeshed with, strangely, is Berlin, where I lived for 5 years. But that city got deeply into my bloodstream, and I hope to write about it. But I'll never know Berlin the way I know Detroit. With Detroit, I understand how things work. I understand the different social groups who live there. I understand the animosities and the antagonisms. I understand the history. I know how people think. When I lived in California and I looked around, I just couldn't figure out how society worked.
Functions.
And it only becomes more complex and disparate and hard to figure out as the years pass. So Detroit remains a kind of fixed point for me. I always have liked writers who have a city at the heart of their work. You can think of Joyce with Dublin. Again, Philip Roth with Newark. He left, he didn't live in Newark, I think, after he left for college, but he wrote about Newark the rest of his life. And I feel the same about Detroit. And also, I just recognized as a writer that I was fortunate to be from Detroit, because Detroit is emblematic of so many realities of American life. You have the racial antagonism between the white and black population, at an intensity in Detroit probably unrivaled in any other city. The entire history of the city has been formed from that. So that's no more, less relevant today than it was when I was a kid growing up. You have the story of American industry, the mechanization of the production of the automobile, all of the money that came out of Detroit. Detroit used to be the fourth richest city. It was the richest city per capita in the United States for a while. And it had a large population, and then lost half of its population, and went from the fourth largest city to much, far down the list. So you have the story of industrial collapse in the Rust Belt, brings up ideas of economic situations in every country. So you have race, industry, economics. You have an interesting history of the discovery of the city and how it was settled. If you write about Detroit, you can almost write about anything having to do with America. So in a sense, I didn't need to find a different city. There wasn't a more interesting city, in my opinion. And also, quite practically, the other cities were already covered. New York had been written about to death. I was never going to write about the West. The South had been claimed. Detroit is more open territory, so I've always written about it.
The next question I was going to ask you about is about your Greek heritage, how important it is to you. As far as I know, half of your ancestry is Greek and half Irish. Correct me if I'm wrong. A curious story. When I was working with the first translator of your work in Bulgarian, he insisted that in Bulgarian we should spell your name not as Eugenides, but as Eugenides, which is the Bulgarian or the Greek transliteration. And I was sort of scandalized because this somehow doesn't fit with the usual rules of transliteration. But he said, but this is so important because his roots are here and because, that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. But joking aside, there's actually a question that just came in that has to do with that question of mine. It's from Christiana Ivanova. Thank you, Mr. Eugenides, for your fantastic opportunity. In Middlesex, you described in great detail the slaughter of locals living in Greek, Bulgarian, Armenian settlements in Asia Minor by Kemal's army. Could you explain your research technique and perhaps your writing routine? Thank you.
Sure. First, I will. I'll just address the heritage question. Yes, it's true. I'm half Greek and half Anglo-Irish. My grandparents immigrated from Asia Minor to the United States, so they were recent immigrants. And on the other side of my family, it actually goes back to 1635, which a fact that I only found out a couple of years ago. Immigrants from both Ireland and England coming into the United States, living in Virginia. Some of them moved down to the South. Some of them went into Kentucky. They lived in the United States for 300 years without ever making any money at all. They were very poor the whole time. So it's not a question of coming over on the Mayflower and having one side of your family amass this great wealth. You can be in this country for centuries and be poorer than actually the Greek immigrants who came here and started a grocery store. And in terms of the pronunciation of my name, I was listening to all of you talk before we began this and hearing Bulgarian, and to my ear, it was very reminiscent of Greek in many ways. So I would think it would be fine to pronounce my name in the Greek fashion. I've anglicized it. Obviously, my family anglicized it so that it could be pronounced in a normative way in the United States. I don't really believe in forcing people to pronounce your name the way you want it to be pronounced, or in the original tongue. In Germany, they call me, Eugenides, and there's different ways of saying my name, and I think that's fine. It's in a way, it's a word that's being translated into the language. So you can call me Eugenides, so you can call me Eugenides in Bulgarian. That's fine with me. In terms of Middlesex and the research I did for the 1915 Armenian massacre and 1922 Greco-Turkish War, it actually, I'm embarrassed to say this, but when I first started writing the book, I didn't think I needed to do any research at all. I just sort of leapt into telling the story of these Greek villagers in Asia Minor in 1922. But very quickly I realized that I didn't know anything, and I couldn't describe, anything that happened. I didn't know what I was talking about. So I was kind of producing a fairy tale-like story, bereft of any specificity. And I realized I had to start reading some history, and I fortunately came across a book about Smyrna in 1922. And from that book, I learned a lot, and it taught me to do more historical research in order to tell the story and to know what happened. As with anything, I think with a novel, you have to take in a lot of information and do a lot of research, but then you have to forget most of it and just use what you need to tell the story you're telling. Because some books read as though they're mainly, research manuals that have been drizzled, or drizzled over a kind of plot line. But I try to stay with the story, and I use the research that is useful to me. So there's kind of a lot in my head that's not in the book, because it would just be too heavy in terms of the structure of the book. It would take too long to describe everything. But I like any writer, I read up on the period. I tried to find what photographs I could. A lot of times in writing Middlesex, it was the palpable things that I needed. I would go to obscure historical museums just to find out the kinds of radios people used in 1920, or the kinds of irons they had. It helped me to visualize the rooms in which people lived and how they spent their days. Newspapers are very handy. You can look at old newspapers to find the advertisements that were there, what sorts of shampoo people use. Things like that are very useful in fiction.
Is that why it takes you so long to write a novel? You write a novel every 9 years. Is it the preparation? Is it that you need time to sort of clean the emotional slate to move on? Or is it the construction of the novel, or a combination of those three? What is it?
It's a combination of those three and about 20 other reasons. There's no, there's in a certain sense, I need to process a huge amount of information unconsciously before I can deploy it into a novel. And so a lot of time passes. I'm always working, I'm always writing and redoing what I'm working on. So, part of it is useful discipline. Part of it is just that I don't know what I'm doing a lot of the time. I'm not the kind of writer that writes. I can write easily. I write every day, but I never like what I write. So I'm constantly throwing it out or deciding that I have to do it a different way. And that there's a good aspect of that, and then there's a very destructive aspect about that I've really never gotten a handle on. And I guess that goes a little bit to just the anxiety of writing itself. Like you're writing something and another person is going to have to read it, and you want it to be the best thing it can be to merit that person's time that the person is going to take to read your book. So that thought never leaves me. And I'm not just writing away because I need to write another book. I'm trying to get it to the best possible expression of what the idea was when I had the idea. So it's all those things. It's research, it's rewriting, it's doubt, it's my own problems with my own character. All those things go into the slowness of my work.
I have 100 more questions of my own, but I'll give precedence to the questions that are coming from our listeners. You have a curious one from Rosen Rachev. He says, why is the novel The Marriage Plot set in the 80s? Is it not possible to have the same characters in the modern setting? And if not, why?
I believe that the 1980s are the modern setting. I was alive in the 1980s. And to me, it is not a historical novel. I know it feels historical to people now. I put it in the 80s because I was that age in the 80s, and I wanted to get the details right. I needed to know what was being read then, how people thought, how they dressed. It would have been difficult, and it would have been more false if I'd written about it in 2020. Also, the book is specific in terms of the introduction of French theory to American universities. The main character, Madeleine Hanna, is reading Derrida and Roland Barthes in college, and that's when all of that material first came over to our shores and started affecting how people read literature. So it wouldn't have been right to it would have just been historically inaccurate to have a student encountering that for the first time in 2012. I mean, the student might encounter it for the first time, but it would have been here for a long time, and it wouldn't be treated in the same way as it was in the 70s. They are trying to make a television series of The Marriage Plot, and I would not be surprised if they update it for that and have the characters in college now. A television show won't be so dependent on the literary material, the literary source material, so they probably would have an easier chance getting away with it. But I agree. I mean, it's that book, a book like The Marriage Plot, or a story like The Marriage Plot, has to be told in a setting that has a number of, I'll say three. I hope there's three factors. It has to be at a time when women are no longer compelled to get married, and a time when women have sexual emancipation, a time when marriages are in no way arranged, and a time when to get divorce is easy. If you look at books like Anna Karenina, for instance, when she leaves her husband to run off with Count Vronsky, this is a huge scandal in Moscow and Russia at the time, and that's wherein lies her tragedy. Now Anna Karenina could just get divorced and run off with Count Vronsky and move to Miami, and it would be fine. So you couldn't get a story with a marriage plot the way you did in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So the book has to be written in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, or 2021. It has to be at a time when divorce is more easily obtained, and when the strictures of the church have lessened to that degree.
A very personal question from Lane Cunningham. Any tips for authors who grew up in a military family and continued moving frequently as an adult, and therefore can't claim a touchstone city or region? It's turned out to be a difficult issue for me as a novelist. That's a curious question.
That's an interesting question. In general, I think you always have to turn your limitations into strengths. It could be said at one time that coming from a little suburb in the Midwest was not a fortunate thing for me as a writer, that it would have been better if I was born in New York or on the coasts or places where more people are interested in that region. But I realized that what I knew was that little place, and if I wrote from that little place, something might come of it. I think what you have going for you is being from a military family and having an experience that most people don't have. Moving from place to place could be, make for a very interesting kind of novel. But also just the whole military atmosphere, the knowledge that you must have from growing up that way. There's not that many writers from that world, so you're way ahead of the game in terms of that. Just never. Dickens said it's a terrible thing to be ashamed of home, and I don't think anyone should be ashamed of home. Home is where you're always going to write from. It's going to be the first principle that you start with. So I would just accept that and embrace it and lead with it.
Maybe the last question. Where did it go? I think Elena closed the last question, but I read it, so I'll still paraphrase it. It was from Gergan Tsenov. It was about your opinion of cancel culture and where you should draw the line as a novelist. It was slightly longer, the question, but that's the part I remember. And that would be the closing question. Milena just nudged me that we need to finish soon. But sure. Yeah, please answer that. Yeah.
Well, we don't have time to define cancel culture to the extent that we could, but in general, I'm not in favor of cancel culture. I'm in favor of open debate and free speech. So I don't think that anybody should be, quote unquote, canceled for an opinion or for something they write. They should be, if you disagree with it, they should be confronted in a debate. I think going down the road of limiting what people can say is very harmful to democratic society. It's very harmful to writing and literature. I'm, very staunch believer in free expression. I mean, the idea that we would start to ban books because they don't express the proper sentiments about issues is just a very, very slippery slope. So,
sorry for interrupting, but the question is actually where the line should be drawn between the personal life of the author and his or her literary works. That was the continuation of the question.
I mean, well, then I just don't. I think any writer knows that the person who writes the books is not identical to the writer whose name is on the book. A fiction writer has to be allowed to go into different points of view, to express different ways of thinking. I could write something about a bigoted person from Detroit, and that would be a true depiction of how people think in Detroit. Would it mean that I share all of those opinions? No, it wouldn't be. And once writing becomes only the expression of proper views, so-called proper views, you're going to have the end of any kind of interesting novel. So the line should never be drawn by anyone outside of the writer. Writers should be able to write what they want to write. Now, as I write myself, I have lines that I draw for myself. I know where I can go in my imagination and what kind of characters I can write about, and then I know which ones would be a stretch, and I know when I would do a bad job of it. So, I don't believe that writers just have freedom to do everything. But I believe that the world can't tell them what to write. I think writers, have to make their own decisions about what kind of stories they can tell. But in general, the tendency is to start looking for paragraphs in books that betray a certain bad quality is not a healthy one for literature. So if you're going to draw that line, I wouldn't draw it very, very, very much at all. I don't see what the benefit of it is really, except for making everyone so scared of getting caught and being tweeted about that they can never write anything interesting ever again.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. It's been hugely enlightening. Too bad we couldn't prolong this to 2 or 3 hours, at least to me. I'm sure for many of the listeners. I'd like to take the opportunity to invite you to come to Bulgaria for a book tour as soon as the situation allows. You have many fans here.
Good,
Not
yeah,
here
happy.
because as I speak, I am on a Greek island, but I'm sure that in Greece you have just as many, but I don't know about them. Even though I bought, interestingly enough, your first book in English, I bought it in Greece, you know, in Chalkidiki, my first copy, and that was back in the late 90s, and then I published it. So everything in this world is connected.
I've always wanted to go to Chalkidiki. I've always wanted to go there. I hear it's beautiful.
Well, should you come visit Bulgaria, I promise that I'll give you a tour. I know the place very well.
Oh, great. Wonderful.
Your books are long sellers here, so you have a huge fandom, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy your time here. So you are invited. It's an open invitation.
Very much. Thank you very much. And I enjoyed this today, and thank you for having me at the festival.
Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, specifically knowing that you are hard on working on your next novel. We are really looking forward, and on behalf of the foundation and our community across the Atlantic, we are super grateful for your time. Please, if you are still on Zoom, you can check the link for the upcoming lineup. The next 2 events this week are with Benjamin Moser on Clarice Respector and with Dmitry Kenarov on Georgy Markov. And stay tuned for our next events. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.